The sound didn't exist. Not really, not there, 60 floors above the feverish chaos of São Paulo. In that penthouse, less a home and more a sanctuary of glass and silence. The only sound that mattered was the one echoing inside Miguel Prado's skull, and at that moment, it was the thunderous fury of the final movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. His arms, clad in black silk, cut through the rarefied air conditioning. Long, pale fingers clenched, wrists turning with surgical precision. He didn't need a baton. He was the baton. The air before him was the orchestra, and the city stretching as far as the pollution allowed him to see was his captive and silent audience. Miguel Prado, at 48, was an architect of legacies, not of stone or steel, but of sound and prestige. His company, Prado Harmonia, wasn't just one of the largest investors in classical music in the country, it was an empire. He discovered talent, financed orchestras, built acoustic theaters that were veritable cathedrals of sound, and in his free time, conducted. Ah, how he conducted. It was his true passion, the only form of transcendence he allowed himself. On the podium, he was a god, molding chaos into beauty, extracting order and passion from dozens of different souls, uniting them under his singular will. Off the podium, he strove to maintain the same order, the same divine distance. His apartment was proof of this, a mausoleum of minimalist design, Italian marble so white it hurt the eyes, dark wood panels that held no family photos, and glass walls that replaced any need for art. The art was out there, the tireless metropolis, a living, pulsating organism that he observed with the detachment of an entomologist studying an ant colony. During the day, a monster of concrete and fury. At night, a tapestry of false diamonds, a river of liquid rubies and topazes flowing through the arteries of the avenues. It was the only chaotic beauty he admired because he could remain above it, untouched. His routine was his religion. He woke at 5 a.m. without an alarm clock. His body was a metronome. Breakfast, black coffee, no sugar, and a single slice of whole wheat bread with avocado, prepared by a ghost housekeeper named Ines, whom he saw perhaps twice a week, and with whom he communicated through concise notes left on the quartz countertop. From 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. he studied scores. He didn't just read them, he dissected them, understanding the composer's intention on an almost cellular level. From 8 a.m. to 8:30 a.m., his personal assistant, Helena, a woman of frightening efficiency and indecipherable emotions, arrived for the daily briefing. "Good morning, Mr. Prado," she said that morning, her voice as neutral as the hum of the air conditioning. She stood exactly 10 feet from the leather armchair where Miguel was finishing his reading. "Your schedule for today: meeting with the Philharmonic's board at 10, lunch with the Minister of Culture at 12:30 p.m. And the audition for the first violinist position is scheduled for 3 p.m. Michael didn't look up from the Mahler score. "Cancel lunch. Tell the minister a family emergency has come up. Send a case of our best Burgundy as an apology." Helen didn't flinch. "A family emergency, sir? Should I specify anything?" Finally, he looked at her. His eyes, a deep grey like the sky before a storm, were his most effective tool. They could inspire terror or devotion, depending on the micro-movement of his facial muscles. "Helen, how many years have you worked for me?" 7 years, sir. And in 7 years, when did I ever have a family emergency?" A tense silence filled the space. The very idea was absurd. Michael Prado had no family. His parents had died over a decade ago. He had no siblings, and most importantly, he had no children. He never would. A doctor's word, spoken when he was only in his 20s, had been the final note in a part of his life before it could even be composed. Idiopathic sterility, a cold, clinical sentence that, at the time, devastated him. He dreamed of a child to whom he could pass on his passion, his knowledge, but the pain, like everything in his life, was processed, compartmentalized, and finally transformed into fuel. If he couldn't create an heir of his blood, he would create a legacy of sound that would echo for centuries. The doctor's decision became poetic license for his solitude, a justification for building his empire without the messy distractions of human bonds. Love, marriage, children were melodies too complex and unpredictable, full of dissonant notes he couldn't control, and Michael Prado needed to control everything. "Use your creativity, Helen," he said, finally dismissing her with a gesture. "That's what I pay you for." She nodded, a statue of efficiency, and withdrew. Michael turned to the window. Below, a green spot in the middle of the grey Trianon Park. With a powerful telescope he discreetly kept in a corner, he sometimes observed. not out of voyeurism, but out of anthropological curiosity. He saw couples, families. He saw a father teaching his daughter to ride a bicycle, the small unbalanced body being supported by strong hands. Once, he allowed himself to feel a pang, a ghost note, but he quickly silenced it. That wasn't his symphony. His was bigger, purer. The day unfolded like a well-rehearsed composition. The meeting with the board was an exercise in power and persuasion. He made them approve the funding for a European tour with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. Every word, every pause, every glance, everything was calculated for maximum effect. He left the meeting room, leaving behind a trail of admiration and a slight fear. That's how he liked it. At 3 o'clock, he was in his private office in the same building, a room paneled in wood that smelled of beeswax and history. The audition room was next door, acoustically isolated. He didn't attend the initial auditions, only the finals. But today, something compelled him to pay attention. The first violin position, the concertmaster, was crucial. He was his second-in-command on stage, the link between the conductor and the orchestra. He needed someone with impeccable technique, but also with soul. At 3:15, Helen entered, her expression harder than usual. "Sir, the 3 o'clock candidate Laura Vargas didn't show up." Miguel felt a wave of irritation, cold and sharp. Lateness was disrespectful. Absence was heresy. In his world, punctuality wasn't a virtue, it was oxygen. "Didn't she answer the phone?" "Went straight to voicemail," Helen replied. "I checked her resume. It's impressive. Graduated with honors from the Geneva Conservatory, played with the Paris Orchestra. But there's a gap in the last 7 years, small concerts, private lessons, nothing grand." The detail of the gap intrigued him for a second, but the irritation won. It was a waste of his time, an imperfection in the score of his day. "Forget it, next," he growled. But the name and the unprofessionalism stuck in his mind. Laura Vargas, the audacity, the lack of consideration. Throughout the afternoon, as he listened to other candidates, some technically brilliant but soulless, others passionate but imprecise, her absence haunted him. It was a silent but deafening note. By the end of the day, back in his glass fortress in the sky, the irritation had fermented and transformed into something more. It was a matter of principle. His empire was built on the rock of discipline and respect. That woman's attitude was a crack in that rock. In a completely atypical impulse, a fortissimo in the middle of a pianissimo passage of his life, he decided that Helen's response wasn't enough. He would handle it himself. He picked up his phone, a black, unadorned monolith, and accessed the file Helen had sent him. Laura Vargas's resume, and there was the phone number. His thumb hovered over the screen. Why was he doing this? A businessman of his caliber didn't call absent candidates. He discarded them. He forgot them. But something about this situation, the gap in her career, the audacity of her absence, compelled him. It was a sour note he needed to correct personally. With a sigh of impatience with himself, he pressed the call icon. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. He was already ready to hang up, to bury the matter, when the call was answered. But there was no "hello." From the other side of the line came a sound that didn't belong to his meticulously orchestrated world. It was a small, hesitant, frightened sound. A child's voice. "Mommy? Mommy can't talk right now," a small voice said, choked with suppressed sobs. "She's looking for the sheet music she lost." Certainly. Continuing directly from the end of part 1, let's dive into the conversation that will forever change Miguel Prado's universe. Part 2, the dissonant note, the voice. That's what threw the universe off balance. Miguel Prado's world was built on sounds he understood, sounds he could name, categorize, and conduct. The smooth legato of a cello, the precise staccato of a violin, the thunderous crescendo of the brass. Even the silence in his penthouse was a sound he controlled, a slow, heavy, deliberate adagio silence. But the voice that came through the phone line was an anomaly, a sound that didn't fit into any score he knew. It was small, thin as a silk thread, and trembling with the moisture of freshly shed tears. Mommy can't talk right now. She's looking for the sheet music she lost." Miguel's first reaction was a flash of pure, icy irritation. What kind of unprofessional slob allowed a child to answer their work phone? It was the height of irresponsibility. His intention was to hang up, order Helena to put the name Laura Vargas on a permanent blacklist, and erase the incident from his memory. But he didn't hang up. The girl's phrase, so obviously a rehearsed euphemism, held him captive, looking for the sheet music she lost. There was a sadness in that metaphor that transcended a simple excuse. "Where is your mother?" Miguel's voice sounded harsher than he intended, the tone of an inquisitor, not someone speaking to a child. There was a pause on the other end, a small, swallowed sob. "She's in her room. The door's closed. Put her on the phone." It was an order. He was used to giving orders and being obeyed. "I can't." The girl's voice was almost a whisper. "She said she needs to be alone. She cries softly so I won't hear, but I always hear." That confession, delivered with a brutal and innocent honesty, was the first crack in his armor of impatience. Cries softly so I won't hear. The image was uncomfortable, unpleasant. He had no room in his life for the melodrama of strangers. "What sheet music did she lose?" he insisted, changing tactics, trying to decipher the code. "Was it for today's audition?" "I think so. It was a very important piece of music. She said this one would let us buy food from a real market, not just the place that gives away leftovers." Each word was a small stone thrown against the glass window of his penthouse. Food from a real market. The phrase hung in the sterile air of Miguel's apartment, a concept as alien as life on another planet. He looked at his kitchen, a showroom of stainless steel and German technology that was mainly used to make coffee. The night before, his dinner had consisted of a sea bass filet with truffle puree, delivered by one of the city's most expensive restaurants. The juxtaposition was so violent, it left him momentarily breathless. "Where's your father?" Miguel asked, the question almost a reflex, the logical solution to a problem of an absent adult. "I don't have a father," the girl replied with desolate simplicity, as if stating that the sky is blue. "Mommy says he's a symphony that never ended, that he left before the most beautiful part, a symphony that never ended." The phrase was poetic, almost beautiful, and terribly familiar. It was something he himself could have said. Miguel felt a chill run down his spine, a shiver that had nothing to do with the controlled temperature of the room. The irritation was dissipating, being replaced by an intense and alarming curiosity. He was a man who hated mysteries because mysteries were uncontrollable, and he was in the middle of one. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softening for the first time, almost imperceptibly. "Clara. And how old are you, Clara?" "7. 7. The number echoed in Miguel's mind. 7 years, the same time as the gap in Laura Vargas's resume. The coincidence was a dissonant note, impossible to ignore. A silent alarm began to sound in the deepest corners of his mind. "Clara," he said slowly, choosing his words with the care of a musician tuning a rare instrument. "Does your mother talk about this symphony? About the man who left?" "Sometimes. When she gets sad and looks at an old photo, it's from a party in a city with some strange stones on the ground. She's playing the violin, and the man is looking at her in a way that nobody ever looks at me. Strange stones on the ground." Miguel's mind traveled instantly. Parity. The streets of irregular cobblestones, the colonial architecture, the humidity of the air mixed with the smell of sea breeze and cachaça. He had been there only once, 7, maybe 8 years ago, for the Flipelo, the literary and musical festival. It had been a rare concession to spontaneity, a deviation from his rigid routine. The alarm in his mind grew louder. "And what's this man like in the photo, Clara?" he asked, his heart beginning to beat at an irregular rhythm, an accelerando he didn't control. "He's tall. He has dark hair but with some gray hairs here," the girl described, and Miguel could almost feel a phantom finger pointing to his own temples. "And he's not really smiling. It's just a smile at the corner of his mouth. Mommy says he was too serious, that he was afraid of life's loud music." The air grew thin in his lungs. Each description was a hammer blow on a tuning fork, vibrating strings within him that hadn't sounded in years. Afraid of life's loud music. It was an accusation, one he had already made to himself on rare sleepless nights. "Your mother, did she say his name?" The question escaped as a whisper, a thread of sound. He felt as if he were on the edge of a precipice, staring into a dark abyss. There was a pause. Michael heard a rustling sound on the other end of the line. "I have Mommy's secret box," Clara whispered conspiratorially. "The photo's here. There's something written on the back, in her handwriting. It's Miguel, Michael Prado." The name, his name. Time stopped. Beethoven's 9th Symphony, still echoing in his memory, was replaced by a high-pitched white hum, a sound of pure nothingness. The phone, a light object of metal and glass, suddenly felt like a ton in his hand. He looked through the glass wall, but he didn't see the city. He saw the face of a woman 7 years younger, her eyes dark and intense, her brown hair falling over her shoulders as she played a passionate Vivaldi on a street corner in Parati, the yellow light of the colonial lampposts creating a halo around her. Laura, he remembered. How could he forget? She was the personification of the loud music of life he so feared, a street violinist with the talent of a concert soloist. They talked for hours about music, about dreams, about the prison of success and the freedom of anonymity. There was a chemistry between them, a resonance that frightened him. He, the maestro of control, felt completely out of control. They spent the night together, and the next morning, overcome by the panic of feeling something real, something that could derail his perfectly planned life, he left before she woke up. He left money on the table, a generous and insulting amount. A payment for services rendered, a way to reduce the experience to a mere transaction, to deny the connection he had felt. It was an act of cowardice, and he never looked back, until now. "Sir, are you still there?" Clara's voice pulled him back from the abyss of memory. Michael couldn't speak. His throat was closed. The word sterile, which had been the cornerstone of his identity for over 2 decades, now flickered in his mind like a faulty neon light. A lie? Had it been a lie? Or was this a trick? An elaborate hoax by a woman he had scorned years ago? The possibility was as plausible as paternity. His analytical mind battled the emotional shockwave. He needed data. He needed proof. "Clara," he managed to say, his voice hoarse, strange to his own ears. "Tell your mother. Tell her I'll be in touch." He hung up before the girl could respond. The phone slipped from his sweaty hand and fell with a dull thud onto the Persian rug. Michael stumbled to the glass wall and pressed his palms against the cold surface. Down below, the city continued its indifferent rhythm, but for him, the world had shifted in tone. The key had been changed. The symphony of his life, which he believed he had perfectly composed and conducted, had just had a shocking new score forcefully inserted into its midst. Fatherhood. The word was a silent thunderclap. He repeated it in his mind. Father. The word was foreign, impossible. He who had built an empire to fill the void left by the absence of an heir could have a daughter. A 7-year-old girl who described her mother's sadness with heartbreaking clarity. Night fell. The city lights came on, but for the first time they brought him no comfort or sense of power. They seemed distant, cold, oblivious to the earthquake happening inside him. He didn't eat. He didn't read. He just sat there, staring into nothingness, while the memory of Parity and Clara's voice waged a battle in his mind. The image of his cowardice, leaving the money on the table. The image of Laura's sleeping face. The sound of a mother's silent weeping and a child's revelation. The hours dragged on. Dawn arrived, painting the sky in shades of purple and grey, and with the first light of day, paralysis gave way to action. The maestro was back in command, but the music was different. It was no longer about legacies of sound, but about the frantic search for truth. He picked up the phone and dialed Helena's number. It was 4:30 a.m. "Mr. Prado?" Her voice was sleepy but instantly alert. "Helena, I need you. Now." His tone wasn't that of a boss but of a drowning man. "I want you to find everything about a woman named Laura Vargas and about a child, a girl named Clara Vargas, approximately 7 years old. I don't want a resume. I want a life. Addresses, accounts, school records, birth certificate, anything. I want to know where they are, what they eat, how they live. Use all resources. Hire whoever is necessary. I don't care about the cost. The only thing that matters is absolute discretion. No one can know I'm investigating. I want a complete dossier on my desk before noon. Do you understand?" There was a split second of silence on the other end, enough time for Helena to register the unprecedented urgency and the almost feverish tone in her boss's voice. "Understood, Mr. Prado. Before noon." He hung up. The sun was rising, setting fire to the edges of the skyscrapers. Miguel Prado watched the sunrise, but not like the maestro at the top of his world. He watched it like a man who had just discovered that the ground beneath his feet might not be real. He saw himself in the reflection of the glass, the dark hair with streaks of grey at the temples, the smile that only existed at the corner of his mouth, the serious man, afraid of life's loud music, the man in the photograph, the unfinished symphony, and for the first time in his adult life, Miguel Prado felt genuine fear, a terrifying and primal note he didn't know how to conduct. The 7 hours following his call to Helena were the longest, most agonizing passage of time in Miguel Prado's life. The sun, which he had seen rise like a wound in the sky, now climbed indifferently, flooding his penthouse with a harsh, unforgiving light that seemed to expose every grain of dust, every doubt in his soul. He, a man who lived by the precise measures of minutes and seconds, felt adrift in a sea of distorted time. he tried to work. He sat down before a score of Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, with its wild pagan rhythms. Normally the complexity would absorb him, but now the notes seemed a meaningless blur, a mockery of his own pretense of controlling chaos. The chaos was within him, and it was deafening. He paced the vast apartment, the sound of his expensive shoes on the marble, the only percussion in his prison of silence. Every car that passed 60 floors below, every distant siren, made him glance at the door, his heart leaping uncontrollably. He was a conductor without an orchestra, a king in an empty castle, awaiting a messenger who could be his savior or his executioner. The image of the girl Clara wouldn't leave him, her voice, her little sob. She cries softly so I won't hear, but I always hear. The phrase was a cruel ostinato, a repetitive theme that refused to leave his mind. For the first time in decades, Miguel felt the texture of guilt. It was rough, uncomfortable. The memory of his cowardice in Paraty was no longer a distant, archived fact, but a vivid, technicolor scene. He hadn't just left a woman with whom he'd had a genuine connection. He had insulted her with his money, a pathetic attempt to erase the humanity of the experience. And what if that night, that act of escape had produced a consequence, a 7-year-old consequence, with a sad voice and eyes he hadn't yet seen? The possibility was a crushing weight on his chest, a pressure that threatened to break his ribs. At 11:47 a.m., the intercom buzzed. Helena's voice, calm and professional as always, announced her arrival. Miguel opened the door. She was there, holding a black leather briefcase, no expression on her face, but her eyes, for a fraction of a second, betrayed a spark of curiosity, perhaps even concern. She had never seen her boss like this, his hair slightly disheveled, his silk shirt rumpled, his grey eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Mr. Prado," she said, entering and placing the briefcase on the glass coffee table. The sound of leather against glass was absurdly loud in the silence. "Speak." Miguel's voice was gravel. Helena remained standing, her posture as impeccable as ever, as if to compensate for the chaos emanating from him. Laura Vargas, 36 years old, only child of middle-class music teachers from Campinas, both deceased. She graduated with honors from the Geneva Conservatory. Impeccable record until 7.5 years ago. After that, the pattern changes drastically. She paused, as if to give him time to prepare. Miguel simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the black folder, Pandora's box. She returned to Brazil abruptly, Helena continued. Over the past 7 years, she's had 17 different addresses, mostly in low-income neighborhoods of São Paulo and the surrounding area. None for more than 6 months, consistent with financial difficulties and evictions. She worked as a music teacher in public schools, a waitress, a telemarketer, a saleswoman. 2 years ago, she was hired as a violinist in a quartet that plays at weddings and corporate events, which seems to have brought some stability. Each word was a blow. The exceptionally talented woman he had met in Paraty, reduced to a life of instability and underemployment. "The child," Miguel said, his voice low. Helena turned a page on her tablet, which she consulted discreetly. "Clara Vargas, born May 23rd, 7 years ago, at the Taubaté Municipal Public Hospital. The birth certificate states Mother Laura Sofia Vargas, father not declared, father not declared." The legal, cold phrase hit him with the force of a punch. He took a step back, his hand instinctively going to his chest. Taubaté. It made sense. It was on the way between Paraty and São Paulo. The chronology was perfect, implacable. "The dossier contains copies of everything," Helena said, her voice still neutral, but with a tone suggesting there was more. "Overdue utility bills, eviction notices, Clara's school records. She's an excellent student, according to the reports. There's also a copy of a drawing she made for a Mother's Day assignment last year." Miguel opened the folder. At the top, behind a cover sheet, was the drawing. It was childish, done with crayons, but the intention was clear. 2 figures, a tall woman with long brown hair and a violin in her hand, and beside her, a small girl. They were holding hands. Above them, a yellow, smiling sun. But in the corner of the drawing, a small male figure drawn in grey, almost like a ghost, was walking away with his back turned. Miguel's heart stopped. He flipped through the documents. They were the anatomy of a struggle. The cold, bureaucratic proof of the story Clara had told him on the phone. The hunger, the fear, the instability, and it all pointed to an origin. A night in Paraty. His act of disappearing hadn't just ended a symphony, it had begun an opera of hardship for her, and a child he didn't even know existed. "The question of my condition," Miguel said without looking at Helena, the word sterility too heavy to be spoken aloud. Helena understood. I did a preliminary check, sir. The doctor who gave you the diagnosis, Dr. Arnold Peixoto, retired 5 years later. He passed away 3 years ago. But the interesting thing is that he was his father's family doctor for over 30 years, and I found records of substantial financial transfers from his father's company to Dr. Peixoto's personal account annually for a decade, starting the year of his diagnosis. Miguel's world tilted violently. The guilt he felt for Laura now mingled with a new and terrible emotion, the icy fury of betrayal. His own father, an authoritarian man who always disapproved of his passion for music, who wanted him as a business successor, not an artist. Had he orchestrated the cruelest lie of all to ensure his son wouldn't be distracted by a family, to keep Miguel focused on the empire? The monstrosity of the idea was so vast, so operatic, that it seemed impossible, and yet it fit perfectly with his father's character. He closed the folder. The sound was definitive. The time for doubt was over. Denial was a luxury he could no longer afford. The probability of Clara being his daughter was overwhelmingly high, but probability wasn't certainty. And Miguel Prado, the maestro of control, needed certainty. He needed irrefutable proof. Helena, he said, his voice now firm, the maestro's voice back in command, but conducting the most difficult piece of his life. Prepare my car and find a lab, the best, the fastest and most discreet in the city. I want a paternity DNA test. And I want the results in 24 hours, no matter the cost. He walked to the phone. And get Laura Vargas's current address, not the address from the file, the exact address of where she and Clara are at this very moment. I'll go there myself. Helena, for the first time in 7 years, showed surprise. Sir, perhaps it would be more prudent if I made the initial contact, to prepare the ground. It could be a shock for her. Miguel looked at her, and in his eyes was a storm of guilt, anger, and iron determination. Helena, the shock happened 7 years ago, one morning in Parity. I was late for the first act. Now, I'm going to make sure I'm present for the rest of the performance. It was a decision made. He, the man who lived above the world, would descend from his glass tower. He would face the music, not as a maestro, protected by the distance of the podium, but as a man, stripped of his certainties, about to find the most important and terrifying note of his entire life. The journey was a descent, not only in altitude, but in status, in reality, in everything Miguel Prado defined as his universe. The armored Mercedes glided silently, a capsule of leather and filtered air, immune to the outside world. But today, for the first time, Miguel felt the city pulsating outside the darkened glass. He left behind the wide tree-lined avenues of Jardins, where shop windows were art galleries, and people walked with the calculated haste of those who have time on their side. Slowly, the scene began to unravel, to transform. The mirrored buildings gave way to commercial townhouses with faded facades. The smooth asphalt became patched. The silence of luxury was replaced by the cacophony of real life, the sound of impatient horns, the cry of a street vendor, the beat of funk music leaking from the windows of a crowded bus. It was the São Paulo he saw from his tower, the abstract urban sprawl, but now gaining texture, smell, and sound, a smell of fried food and diesel, a sound of struggle and life. It was nauseating and fascinating. In his lap, the black leather briefcase seemed like an artifact from another planet. Inside it, the lives of Laura and Clara reduced to papers and numbers. But where he was going, there would be no papers. There would be faces. Helena had given him the address with an efficiency bordering on the macabre, a low-rise condominium complex in an East Zone neighborhood that Miguel only knew by name, a place he associated with traffic and violence statistics in the newspapers. As the car entered increasingly narrow streets, he felt a tightness in his chest. It was her territory. He was the invader. He rehearsed his speech in his mind. It would be direct, clinical. Laura, I have received information that leads me to believe there is a possibility I am the father of your daughter. For the benefit of all parties involved, and so that appropriate responsibilities can be established, I suggest we perform a DNA test as soon as possible. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like a contract. But the image of Clara's drawing, the little grey man walking away, tore the script to pieces. The driver, a man trained to be invisible, stopped in front of a 4-story building complex with faded beige paint and identical windows. This is it, sir. Miguel looked out the window. Children ran in a cracked cement courtyard, clothes dried on makeshift clotheslines on the balconies. There was a sense of community, of intertwined lives, so different from his antiseptic solitude. He felt a primitive fear. In his world, he was the maestro. Here, he didn't even know how to read the score. "Wait here," he said to the driver, his voice lower than usual. He got out of the car, and the world hit him. The air was warmer, more humid. The sounds were louder. He adjusted his expensive suit, feeling absurdly out of place, a penguin among a flock of pigeons. He entered Building C, the smell of bleach and cooking beans invading his nostrils. He climbed 3 flights of stairs, his heart pounding against his ribs. Apartment 34, a simple wooden door, with the paint peeling near the doorknob. He stood before it for a long moment. From inside, he heard the faint and hesitant sound of a violin. It wasn't a concert piece, it was scales, warm-up exercises. The sound stopped. He raised his hand, his knuckles hovering inches from the wood. This was it, the note that would change the entire composition. He knocked. 3 sharp, firm knocks. The ensuing silence was heavy. Then he heard the sound of small feet running, followed by a woman's muffled voice. "Clara, no, let me answer it." The door opened, and time, once again, fractured. Laura Vargas stood there. 7 years had passed, but he would recognize her anywhere. There were new lines of weariness around her eyes, but they were the same dark, intense eyes that had captivated him in Parity. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore a simple t-shirt and sweatpants. She wasn't the ethereal musician of his memory, but a real woman, forged by time and hardship. Her face went through a succession of emotions at a dizzying speed. First, the confusion of seeing a stranger in a suit at her door. Then, a flicker of recognition, followed by a shock so profound that she paled, her mouth slightly open. The shock gave way to disbelief, and finally to a cold, protective anger. She moved instinctively, trying to close the door. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was a fierce whisper, but before the door could close, a head of curly hair appeared in the crack, peeking from behind her mother's leg. It was Clara's eyes. Large, brown, curious. She looked at Miguel's face, and the recognition was instantaneous. "Mom," she said, her voice clear and without hesitation, "it's the man from the sheet music." The sentence was like a match struck in a room full of gas. Laura froze, her hand on the door. Her gaze darted from Miguel to her daughter, her face contorted in a mask of panic and fury. Miguel felt the air leave his lungs, seeing her, really seeing her. She was a small, thin girl, but with a seriousness in her gaze that was disturbingly familiar. It was his look. He saw it every day in the mirror. That was his DNA there, standing in the hallway looking at him. The file was a ghost. That girl was flesh and blood. "Laura," he managed to say, the name scratching his throat. All his rehearsed speech, all his clinical composure evaporated. "How did you find me?" she hissed, her body as taut as a violin string about to snap. "What do you want? Did you come to leave more money? Did the exchange rate change in the last 7 years? The venom in her words stung him, but he deserved it. He deserved every drop. "No, we need to talk," he said, his voice surprisingly unsteady. "No, we don't. We have nothing to talk about. You made that perfectly clear 7 years ago." She tried to close the door again, but he placed his hand flat against the wood, preventing her. A gesture he regretted the instant he made it. It was an act of power, a reflection of who he was, and it was the last thing the situation called for. Laura's eyes burned. "Take your hand off my door, please," he said, and the word sounded strange in his own mouth. He wasn't asking, he was ordering. 5 minutes. For her. He looked at Clara, who was now clinging to her mother's leg, her gaze fixed on him, a mixture of fear and fascination. It was the look at his daughter that broke Laura's resistance. She saw the determination on Miguel's face, a determination she hadn't seen since that night in Parity. With a sigh that was pure defeat and anger, she stepped back, opening the door. The apartment was tiny, a small living room that also served as a dining room. Simple furniture, worn with use. Bookshelves crammed with books and sheet music, a smell of home, of life, of things he didn't understand. It was clean, it was organized, but the poverty was palpable, an embarrassing silence between the pieces of furniture. In one corner, a violin case lay open. "Say what you have to say and leave," Laura said, arms crossed, positioning herself between him and Clara, a human shield. Miguel entered, feeling like a clumsy giant in that small space. His suit seemed to scream opulence. He felt obscene. "I know," he began, his voice low. "About Clara." "You know nothing," she retorted. "You don't even have the right to say her name." "I received your resume," he continued, trying to find a path, a logic. "The audition, the 7-year gap I called." "And a child answered." Laura finished, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I imagine the shock for the great Maestro Miguel Prado. Real people, with real problems, must have ruined your day. Yes, he admitted with an honesty that surprised her. Ruined it, destroyed it, turned everything upside down. He looked at Clara, who still watched him silently. Laura, I need to know the truth. No games, no accusations, just the truth. She laughed, a soundless sound. The truth? You want the truth? The truth is that you ran away like a coward. The truth is that I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks later, alone and penniless. The truth is that I've struggled every day for the past 7 years to give her a decent life, while you probably didn't even remember my name. That's the truth. Satisfied? Each word was a deserved blow. He absorbed them without defending himself. No, he said finally. Not satisfied, because there's another truth. My whole life I was told I couldn't have children, that I was sterile. Laura stared at him, the anger on her face giving way to a flicker of confusion. What? It was a diagnosis I received when I was 20. It was the foundation upon which I built my entire life, he explained, his voice gaining an urgent intensity. I never, in a million years, considered the possibility, until yesterday. He saw the doubt in her eyes. She wasn't sure if she believed him, if this was just another trick, another excuse. I don't care about your excuses, she said, her voice weaker. It doesn't change anything. It changes everything, he insisted. Laura, if she's my daughter, if there's even a chance, I can't and I won't. He stopped, unable to articulate the enormity of what he felt. The guilt, the responsibility, the strange and terrifying flicker of hope. He took a deep breath, returning to his original plan, the only concrete thing he could hold on to. I want to do a DNA test. The request, so clinical, so cold, brought the anger back to her face. Oh, sure. Standard procedure. You walk into my life, turn it upside down, and now you want scientific proof. As if she were an item in an auction you need to authenticate before you bid. That's not it, he said, frustrated with his own inability to communicate. It's to be sure, so there's no doubt. For me, for you, for her. I have no doubts, Miguel, she said, his name sounding like a curse. I've lived with certainty every day. They stared at each other in a stalemate. The tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. It was Clara who broke it. She stepped forward, emerging from behind her mother. Are you the symphony? She asked, her voice small but clear, looking directly at Miguel. The one that never ended? The blow struck him straight to the heart. Miguel felt his knees weaken. He knelt, getting down to her level, a movement that seemed to require a Herculean effort. He looked into the eyes of that child and saw a universe of questions. I don't know, he replied, his voice choked, but I'd like to find out. Laura watched the scene, her heart in a civil war. The anger she felt for this man battled against the pain she saw in his eyes, and above all, the love for her daughter. Clara deserved answers. She deserved more than the life she could give her. The test, she said, her voice resigned. We'll do the test, but on my terms. Miguel stood up, his gaze still fixed on Clara, but his attention turned to Laura. Any terms. It will be at a lab of my choosing, and you will never again show up at my door unannounced. Contact will be through lawyers or a third party. You won't turn my daughter's life into a circus. Agreed, he said without hesitation. A fragile agreement was sealed in the middle of that small room. There was no relief, only the weight of what was to come. Miguel knew it was time to go. He gave one last look at Clara, etching her face into his memory. I'll sort this out, he said to Laura, a promise. He turned and left, closing the door behind him. As he descended the stairs, the smell of beans and life seemed to follow him. He entered the silent refuge of his Mercedes, the contrast with Laura's apartment physically assaulting him. The maestro was back in his ivory tower, but the tower was cracked. He was no longer just the conductor of his own life. He was now part of an unexpected duet, a complex and painful melody he had barely begun to learn, and as the car pulled away, leaving the beige building behind, he knew that the result of that test wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the end of the prelude. The following day was a composition in a single tone: anxiety. For a man who prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize, to isolate emotions so they wouldn't interfere with the logic of his days, the wait for the DNA test result was a form of exquisite torture. Michael Prado discovered that all his mental boxes had broken and emotions were leaking everywhere, staining the score of his routine. The procedure itself had been a surreal exercise in contrast. The morning after the meeting with Laura, a discreet nurse dressed in an impeccable white uniform arrived at his penthouse. In an environment of monastic silence, she collected the genetic material with the aseptic efficiency of someone cataloguing an artifact. A cotton swab on the inside of his cheek, a plastic tube sealed in a padded envelope, a barcode. He was, at that moment, reduced to a biological sample, a set of data to be cross-referenced with another. Simultaneously, he knew a similar process was happening in the modest apartment in the East Zone, an event that for Clara must have been confusing and perhaps a little frightening. The image of her, looking at a cotton swab with her serious eyes, haunted him. After the nurse left, the silence in his apartment, once a source of power and clarity, became oppressive, heavy. Each second dragged on with the slowness of a funeral dirge. He tried to take refuge in work, but the financial spreadsheets of Prado Harmonia seemed like a foreign language. He sat down at the grand piano, a magnificent Fazioli that occupied a place of honor in the room, his fingers hovering over the ivory keys. He thought of playing Bach. The mathematical architecture of his fugues always calmed him, but his fingers didn't obey. In his mind, he didn't hear complex counterpoints. He heard the voice of a little girl asking, "Are you the symphony?" Clara's question had completely disarmed him. It was deeper than she could imagine. He had spent his whole life believing he was the complete symphony, the composer, the conductor, the orchestra, and the concert hall, all in one, a closed and self-sufficient system. Now, he was forced to face the possibility that he wasn't the whole piece, but only a movement, a long, solitary and arrogant movement, perhaps, but incomplete, and that the rest of the symphony, the scherzo, the adagio, the finale, was living in a three-room apartment, struggling to pay the bills. He rose from the piano and walked to a bookshelf where, in an understated silver frame, sat an old photograph. Him and his father, in front of the Municipal Theatre. Michael was a young man in his 20s, thin, with longer hair and a glint of ambition in his eyes. His father, a corpulent man in a suit with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, had his hand possessively on his shoulder. For years, Michael had looked at that photo with a mixture of respect and resentment. Respect for the empire his father had built and which he had inherited and expanded. Resentment for his father's constant disapproval of his distraction with music. Now, looking at the photo, he felt only a cold, abyssal fury. The financial transfers to Dr. Peixoto, which Helen had discovered, were proof of a betrayal of Shakespearean proportions. His father hadn't just manipulated him, he had robbed him of the possibility of choice, robbed him of the truth. He had sentenced him to a life of solitude, not to protect him, but to mold him in his own image to ensure the empire had a focused and undistracted heir. The irony was cruel. In trying to prevent him from having an heir, his father had ensured that, when Michael finally discovered the truth, the heir he would find would be a stranger, a child already 7 years into a life lived far from him. The rage was so intense that he picked up the picture frame and, with a brusque movement, tucked it into a drawer, his father's face now hidden in the darkness. The 24 hours promised by the lab stretched into an eternity. He didn't eat, he didn't sleep, he just waited. Finally, late in the afternoon of the following day, the intercom buzzed. "Helen is here, sir." His heart leaped. He took a deep breath, recomposing his mask of composure, and opened the door. She was there, holding a single large, heavy white envelope. Her face was, as always, impassive, but she didn't hand it to him immediately. "The results are in," she said, her voice soft. "How do you wish to proceed?" It was her way of asking if he was all right, if he was ready. "Give it to me," he said, his voice firm. He took the envelope. It was cold to the touch. He walked to the glass wall, turning his back to Helen, needing that moment of privacy. He looked out at the city below, a blur of lights beginning to ignite with the twilight. For a moment he considered not opening it, ripping the envelope and throwing the pieces into the void, returning to his life of certainties, even if they were false certainties. But he knew he couldn't. The dissonant note had been played. The composition was already altered forever. With slightly trembling fingers, he tore open the flap of the envelope. Inside, there was a multi-page report, full of genetic marker charts and scientific jargon, but he didn't need to read it all. His eyes went straight to the last page, to the conclusion. He read it once, twice, 3 times, the words burning into his retinas. Genetic linkage analysis. Applicant Miguel Almeida Prado. Child Clara Vargas. Conclusion. The probability of paternity is 99.99999%. Based on the analyzed DNA markers, Miguel Almeida Prado cannot be excluded As the biological father of Clara Vargas, the world didn't end with a bang. It dissolved into a profound and absolute silence. The paper in his hand was the proof, the mathematics of biology, the irrefutable truth. 99.9%. The infinitesimal margin of doubt was a statistical formality, a mockery of the absolute certainty he now felt in every cell of his body. He was a father. The word echoed in the silence of his mind. Father. He lowered the paper, his arm falling to his side. The reflection in the glass showed him a stranger, a 48-year-old man, at the height of his power and success, who had just discovered that the central pillar of his existence was a lie, and that the most important piece of his life had been missing for 7 years. A wave of emotions hit him, so overwhelming that he had to lean against the cold glass to avoid falling. There was the anger towards his father. There was the crushing guilt towards Laura and everything she had gone through. There was the fear of the unknown, of a future he didn't know how to navigate. But beneath all that, there was something else, something he hadn't felt for a very, very long time. A small and fragile seed of joy. No, it was more complex than that. It was a feeling of connection, of belonging. The symphony of his life wasn't incomplete. It had another movement he had just discovered. Mr. Prado. Helena's voice, coming from afar, brought him back. He turned. The mask had fallen. His face was bare, showing the devastation and wonder of that moment. "Call my lawyers," he said, his voice hoarse. The first reaction was that of the old Miguel, the businessman. "Prepare a trust fund, the best one, with everything she needs. School, health, housing. I want their lives to be taken care of immediately." "Yes, sir," said Helena, picking up her phone. "Wait," he interrupted her. He looked again at the file, which was still on the table. He looked at Clara's drawing. The little grey man with his back turned. The solution wasn't just money. Money was what he had used to insult Laura 7 years ago. Using money now, however well-intentioned, would only be a repetition of the same mistake, on a larger scale. It would be another attempt to erase the humanity of the situation, to solve an emotional problem with a financial solution. "No," he said more to himself than to her. "Cancel the lawyers, for now." He approached the table and picked up the drawing. He looked at the figure of the little girl holding hands with her mother, a violinist, the daughter of a violinist, his daughter. An idea began to form, a gesture, not a solution, but a beginning, a first step on a bridge he would need to build, stone by stone. "Helen," he said, his voice now clear with a new kind of determination, "I need you to find something for me. Not the best on the market, not the most expensive. I want the best for a 7-year-old learning to play. A 3/4 size violin, of good wood with a warm sound. I also want the best teacher in Sao Paulo, someone with patience and a kind heart, for private lessons." Helen stared at him, surprise finally breaking through her professional facade. "Deliver it to her house," Miguel continued, ignoring her surprise. "Today, no cards, no identification, just a note." He took a pen and a small notepad from his desk. His handwriting, normally angular and hurried, came out smoother. He thought for a moment and wrote just 5 words. "So that the music never stops." He handed the note to Helen. "Make sure she receives this." "Yes, sir," she said, taking the note with a gentleness he had never seen in her. After she left, Miguel was alone again. But the silence was no longer oppressive. It was different. It was full of potential, full of a new and terrifying melody. He didn't know what the next notes would be. He knew the path would be difficult, that Laura's anger was justified, and that trust was something he would take years to earn, if he ever could. But looking out the window at the city lighting up, he no longer felt like a conductor in his tower, directing a distant world. He felt like a student, facing a new and incredibly complex score, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. He was ready to learn. The violin's arrival was a silent event, but with the impact of an explosion. Laura answered the door and found a delivery man holding a black case, elegant and perfectly sized for a child. Her first reaction was refusal, a reflex of pride. She didn't accept charity, but the delivery man simply said it was already paid for, and that there was a note. He left the case in the hallway and departed. Her heart racing, Laura took it inside. Clara, upon seeing the case, had her eyes wide, a mixture of astonishment and reverence. Inside, the violin rested on deep blue velvet. It was beautiful. The wood shone with a honey tone, and it was evident even to a layman that it was an instrument of exceptional quality, far superior to the worn, rented study violin Laura used to teach her daughter. Then she saw the note, a small white card with elegant and restrained handwriting, 5 words, so that the music never stops. Laura sat on the sofa, the card trembling in her hand. There was no name, but it wasn't necessary. Only one man in the world could have sent that. That gesture disarmed her more than any apology or offer of money. Michael wasn't trying to buy forgiveness. He wasn't trying to impose himself. He was speaking the only language they both understood perfectly: music. It was a gift, not for the daughter he barely knew, but for the musician within her. It was an act of respect. For the first time in 7 years, thinking of Miguel Prado, she didn't feel only anger. She felt an uncomfortable and confusing wave of something more. And when the phone rang the next day, and a calm voice introduced himself as one of the best violin teachers in São Paulo, saying he had been anonymously hired to teach Laura, after a long pause, accepted. The months that followed were a slow composition, an adagio built on cautious gestures and meaningful silences. Michael kept his promise. He kept his distance. There were no more surprise appearances. Communication was through Helen, who had become a kind of unlikely intermediary. But his presence was felt. One day Laura received a notification that her rent for the next 2 years had been paid by a Young Musicians Incentive Fund. She knew where it came from, but the discreet, impersonal way allowed her to accept without feeling her dignity was being bought. With the financial burden lifted, she could leave the sporadic jobs and dedicate herself more to music and Clara. Michael, in turn, was on his own journey of transformation. The DNA test results hadn't magically transformed him into a loving father, but it had imbued him with a sense of purpose he'd never had. He began to use his power and fortune in a new way, not to build concert halls, but to build a bridge. He received weekly reports from Clara's teacher. He knew of her progress, the pieces she was learning, and one day, the teacher mentioned there would be a small student recital. Michael went. He sat at the back of the small auditorium, hidden in the shadows, his heart beating faster than at any premiere he had ever conducted, and then he saw her. Clara walked onto the stage, small and serious, holding the violin he had given her. She gave a clumsy curtsy and began to play a simple Bach melody. The notes weren't perfect. There was hesitation, a slight scratch of the bow here and there, but she played with a concentration, a passion that was a mirror of her mother, a mirror of himself. In that moment, watching his daughter create music, Michael felt the last walls of his old life crumble. The love for that child wasn't a decision, it was a fact, as real and irrefutable as the DNA they shared. At the end of the performance, when Clara smiled at the applauding audience, her eyes met his for a split second. He didn't know if she recognized him, but he gave her an almost imperceptible nod before leaving, his face wet with tears he didn't know he was capable of crying. It was Laura who took the next step. A week after the recital, she called him, not Helena, but his personal number. "He wants to see you," was all she said. They met in a neutral place, the Botanical Garden. It was a sunny Sunday. Michael arrived early, hands sweating, feeling like a teenager on his first date. When Laura and Clara approached, he saw something had changed. The hostility in Laura's eyes had been replaced by cautious curiosity, and Clara didn't hide behind her mother. She ran towards him. "You came," she said, stopping a few feet away. "Did you like my recital?" "I loved it," he replied, his voice choked. "You were magnificent." That day was the first of many. Walks in the park, museum visits, afternoons listening to Clara practice. Michael learned to be a father in small steps. He learned that she didn't like broccoli, that she was afraid of thunder, and that her favorite color was the velvet blue of her violin case. Laura watched everything from a calculated distance, but Michael saw the thaw in her eyes. They started talking, about music, about the past, about the 7 years lost. He told her about his father's betrayal, not as an excuse, but as a confession. She told him about the loneliness and the difficulties, not as an accusation, but as a testimony. A fragile but genuine friendship was being born from the ashes of their troubled history. The crisis came on a perfect autumn day. They were having a picnic in the park. Michael was telling Clara stories about the great composers, and Laura was smiling, a genuine, relaxed smile he hadn't seen since Parity. Suddenly, in the middle of a laugh, Clara went pale, put her hand to her chest, and collapsed onto the grass. Michael's world transformed into a tunnel of panic and sirens. The hospital, the agonizing wait, the doctor's cold words. The diagnosis was brutal: Alport syndrome, a rare genetic disease affecting the kidneys. Clara's condition was aggressive. Her kidneys were failing rapidly. She needed a transplant. The word genetic echoed in Michael's mind. The doctors explained that the disease was hereditary. His world, which had finally found a center, a balance, was collapsing again. The search for a donor began. Laura was tested immediately. She wasn't a match. Despair set in. "Aye," Michael said to the doctors, "test me." It was during the compatibility tests that the final truth came to light. A nephrologist reviewing Michael's complete history frowned. "Mr. Prado, there's something in your old exams, and in the new ones. You have the same genetic anomaly, a much milder variant, almost asymptomatic, that would probably never cause you serious problems. But it's there. The infertility diagnosis you were given in your youth, medically based on this, it's impossible. Actually, this genetic condition is definitive proof of his connection to his daughter. The irony was divinely cruel and divinely graceful. His father's lie had not only condemned him to solitude, but had also hidden from him a condition that could now save his daughter. And of course, he was a perfect donor. When he told Laura, in the sterile corridor of the hospital, she collapsed into his arms, weeping. All the barriers, all the anger, all the pain of the last 7 years dissolved in that embrace. "You'll risk it for her," she sobbed. "Laura," he said, holding her face in his hands. "She's not a risk. She's the only thing that makes sense. I'm not giving a part of myself. I'm becoming whole." The surgery was a success. Michael awoke in a hospital room, the pain in his side a physical reminder of his act. Helen was there. "Clara is fine," she said, her voice finally filled with emotion. "And Laura hasn't left your side." In the days that followed, the hospital became a sanctuary. Laura cared for both of them, moving between rooms, her face tired but illuminated by hope. In those days of shared vulnerability, they fell in love again, or perhaps for the first time truly. Not the feverish passion of a night in Paraty, but a deep love, forged in fear, sacrifice, and rediscovery. 1 year later. The setting is a park in Blumenau, Brazil. The Santa Catarina sunlight filters through the trees, painting the ground gold. Clara, now 9, runs through the grass, healthy, vibrant. The sound of her laughter is the most beautiful melody Michael has ever heard. She no longer has a 3/4 violin. Now she has a full-sized one, a birthday present from her parents. Michael and Laura sit on a bench, hand in hand, watching her. He no longer lives in the glass penthouse. They bought a house in São Paulo, with a large garden for Clara to run in, and a music studio where the sounds of piano and violin blend daily. "Do you remember that night in Paraty?" Laura asks, her head resting on his shoulder. "I thought you were an unfinished symphony." "I was," he replies. "I was a long, lonely prelude. You two, you are the rest of the piece, the most beautiful part." He turns to her, his grey eyes now warm and filled with a peace he never knew. He takes a small box from his pocket. There is no crowd, no orchestra, it's just them. "Laura Vargas," he says, his voice steady. "You taught me that life isn't a score to be controlled, but a song to be felt. You and Clara are my masterpiece. Marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of being the finale of our symphony." The tears streaming down Laura's face are tears of pure joy. She says yes as Clara runs toward them, embracing them, uniting them in a perfect chord. Michael Prado, the former maestro of solitude, finally found his place. He realized that a legacy isn't built with stone or sound, but with moments, with laughter in a park, with bedtime stories, with the warmth of a hand holding his. He no longer needed to conduct the world from a tower. His world was there, in those 2 pairs of eyes that looked at him with love. The symphony, at last, was complete, and it was more magnificent than he could have ever dreamed.